At last! After 6 bleeding months of waiting on feedback on these custom support cards because the card adjudicators kept sitting on the review response deadline like a 4-year-old waiting on their parents' 3 card, but I'm not bitter! So yeah, this is Doctor's Notes, a companion series to Deck Doctors where I address and adjust the issues with the custom support in order to make them playable. Because while I do put myself in a position of authority, I'm still only human, so I'm still prone to making mistakes. So for the sake of fairness, I'm going to be reviewing over the existing support in order to correct these mistakes. Of course, I'm only able to do the first 5 archetypes because they were only the ones who got reviewed on the server, but I'm not bitter! So anyway, rather than going in chronological order, as would be normal in this case, I'll be ordering this in the order of least amount of changes to the most. As such, we'll start the review with BLS. Of the first 5 archetypes I reviewed, this one was close to perfect in terms of playability. As such, it's the only one thus far that has been approved as of this video going up. There were a few PSCT issues, but that also applies to damn near every archetype on this list, so I'm not going to mention it. The only real issue out of this came from BLS Sinful Soldier, in that his second effect in shuffling any banished monster into the deck to negate was deemed a bit too generic. So in order to compensate, I had to change it to specifically shuffle a banished warrior monster instead, forcing the deck to play it the way it was supposed to be. Other than that, everything else was fine, and the deck has been approved as I mentioned before, so this likely won't appear on another episode of Doctor's Notes. Unlike the next archetype on the list, which would be the Arcana Force support. While I was lucky in having a rather helpful adjudicator review BLS, these next 2 were reviewed by one that was not so helpful. This one in particular left me with little to nothing to work on in regard to addressing issues with the deck. The only concrete thing I could garner is that they didn't like the idea of win-win coin toss effects, but they didn't give me any examples, and the only ones I could find on my own with specifically win-win effects were Hermit and Hierophant. I changed the Hermit's Tails effect to send to the graveyard instead of special summoning, something that the deck really doesn't benefit from, and removed the specifications on the Heads effect, forcing the Heads effect on the monster it summons. The Hierophant's Heads effect was nerfed a bit to make the discard a random discard and only drawing 1 card instead of 2. I also put a hard once per turn clause on the monster effect instead of the soft one it had before because I realized that it could indeed fit on the card. But unfortunately, that's the best I could do on what little information I got, and I'm almost guaranteed to see this on the next episode because none of this actually addresses the actual problems with this new support. I know there's still some world lock shenanigans to be had in this support, but without any feedback on exactly what the problem cards are, I can't exactly fix them right now. All I can really do is just resubmit them and wait for God knows how long to actually get reviewed by someone who's actually helpful in this. The next one we'll be covering is Red Eyes, and while this one was reviewed by the same person who reviewed the last one, I will give her credit in that she had improved since then in terms of being helpful. Of course, she then immediately blew that credibility by ghosting me on whether or not the changes made were enough, so we're back to square one here. She did point out 3 cards which were the most problematic, so I at least have something to work towards in this one. First of all, we have Red Eye Swordsman of Landstar. This one had an issue that I actually brought up in the original video, in that it's a 1-card link 3. I should have realized back then that that was a problem, especially considering that Summon Sorceress was still legal when that video went up. As a result of this notification, I removed the tribute costs on its first effect to prevent it from triggering its second effect on its own. I also changed the effect to special summon another Red Eyes monster from the graveyard instead of itself, so it requires a little extra effort to set up. Hopefully that should be enough to make it still good, but not completely broken. The next card that was problematic was one that I already had an issue with, and that is Red Eyes Time Sage. Much like with the last archetype, win-win coin toss effects were the issue here, especially since said effects were very much extreme wins for the deck. As such, I ended up nerfing the Tails effect so that it tributes itself in order to mill, and I removed the burn damage that came with it. I also put a hard once per turn on the effect since the above changes left me enough room to do so. As far as I'm concerned, this is much better than it was, but it still remains to be seen if that's enough for her. The last card change is Red Eye's Thousand Dragon. This one I feel was perfectly fine, but since I'm not in a position to argue with them at this moment, I'm forced to bend over backwards. The issue came with the on-summon effect being able to search any dragon monster, even though it only recycles from the graveyard and it requires you to use a Red Eye's normal monster to use the effect. But as a compromise, I changed it to recycling a Red Eye's card instead. Note I said card, not monster, so you can also recycle some of the spell and trap support, so it's still pretty good considering the effort needed to use the effect. Again, feedback on these changes never came, so whether or not these three will be enough to get it approved still remains to be seen. Next up, we have the Guardian support, the very first ones I made on this channel, and therefore one of the most flawed. First things first, let's go ahead and address the elephant in the room. The unique new support, as in the ones that weren't anime adaptations, didn't have card artworks on them and were left with a proxy image instead. The reason for this is that Deck Doctors was originally supposed to be a two-man job, with me providing the card designs and Zach, being the art major, providing the artworks. However, like with most long-term collaborations between two very busy people, things just didn't work out that way. He's since expressed interest in still seeing this one through at least, so I may end up changing the artwork for these later, but unless and until that happens, here's the artworks that I slapped together myself. I based these off of Arsenal Summoner's design in that each one is wielding the weapon and corresponding original Guardian that matches their own attribute. I didn't intend for them all to be female aside from Arsenal and Royal Guardian, but one, as it turns out, they were the most consistent and workable designs for whatever reason, and two, I don't hear any of you bitches complaining about it either. I will admit that I ended up screwing myself over when it came to Greater Guardian and the combination of its type, attribute, and corresponding weapon, but thankfully I was able to find something that worked. And yes, I just ended up using a mirrored, stretched, and filtered version of Pot G's artwork for Arsenal Hall because why the fuck wouldn't I? It's absolutely perfect. Now beyond this, there are two other issues with the archetype. One major problem that required a minor change, and a minor problem that needed a major one. Starting with the big issue first, in that I somehow forgot to put a hard once per turn clause on both Hunter and Royal Guardian's effects. The only explanation for this I can think of is that the text on them was so long in having to specifically list each of the Guardian equips that it just happened to slip my mind. But regardless of the reasoning, it was a stupid mistake, one that could have easily broken the entire archetype, and I'm glad someone caught that. The other issue is one that's a bit more subjective. In the original video, I had suggested giving erratas to the non-Guardians since specifically excluding them in every card would be obnoxiously difficult, and even impossible on a few of these. However, while I outlined these erratas in the original video, I did not provide an actual card for any of them, leading to unnecessary confusion in the review process. I did this mainly since I didn't believe anyone would actually play them with or without the errata, but considering I went out of my way to provide Norden's errata in the Entities video, it's still a stupid mistake and I really should have done the same here. So here they are if absolutely anyone still cares about them. To quickly recap, Celtic Guardian is renamed Celtic Guard since that's the name of its 3-card archetype anyway. The Winged Dragons simply lose the word Guardian in their names and absolutely nothing of value is lost. And the last two have a name clause on them that specifically exclude them from the archetype, changed from the original name change that it had in the video because this was determined to be less confusing and much simpler in the long run. Hopefully that alleviates any further confusion with the support. Lastly, it's time we moved on to the entity support. I stand by everything I said in this video, but that does not excuse the fact that I went ways overboard with the support here. In attempting to undo the injustice dealt to this small set of cards, I overcorrected and made the archetype such a jumbled mess that even Blackwings would look askance at them. In addition to that, I made the support before I joined the customs card server and therefore didn't have any idea of the logical restrictions they had, meaning that I made way too many of them for them to even be considered approvable. As such, this one archetype is going to need more changes than all 4 of the others combined. Strap on in because this is going to be one long, bumpy ass ride. Let's start with the main deck monsters since they're the ones that had the most cut. For the sake of consistency, more than 2/3 of the Pringles have been cut from the archetype, among which are Byakhee, Chthonian, Loigor, Magnum Anominatium, Servitor, Tagwa, Vian, Zeern, and Zoog. Most of these cards were as pack-fillery trash as they come and will not be missed in the slightest. Magnum Anominatium stings a little, but with Nibiru being a thing, I don't think I'll miss it too much. I will say I like Zeern's effect, but as long as I don't have to look at this horrible artwork, I'm sure I'll be able to sleep at night. Maybe I'll keep this effect in mind if I ever review artifacts. Lastly, there's the one card of this lot that I actually felt was good, that being Zoog. The effect was arguably the best one in the main deck and greatly helped consistency. However, I felt like the ones that actually survived the cutting room floor, those being Migo, Nightgaunt, Shantak, and Shoggoth, were more iconic among cosmic horror fans and was therefore more deserving of an actual spot in the archetype. However, that doesn't mean I abandoned the effect of Zoog, since of the 4 surviving monsters, only Shoggoth remained relatively intact from his initial iteration. Even then, it still got some changes in that the effect can special summon itself from the graveyard as well as the hand, but it can't be used as material for a non-entity monster. The other 3 had a lot more changes applied to them, so much so that they're almost unrecognizable from their original iterations. For starters, they're all level 2s now. Honestly, I'm not sure what I was thinking with all the level 4s in the main deck, since the rank 4 Xyz monsters want to use fusion and synchro monsters as material instead. The synchros very much prefer level 2s, and the fusions couldn't care less either way about the levels. In addition to that, with Servitor gone, I was able to make Nightgaunt a more appropriate fiend type, which in turn meant that I could make Shantak a winged beast instead of a reptile for whatever random reason. Also, since there's now a more consistency in the attributes, I also decided to change Shantak to a dark in order to match the other 3. And since there's a lot fewer tuners in the archetype, I also decided to make Migo one to compensate. On top of all that, each of them has a brand new effect to match as well. Migo is given a variation of Zoog's effect, being able to search or recycle a poly or fusion card on summon, and allows you to match an entity's level to its own, but it locks you out of non-entity extra deck plays for the next 2 turns after you use either of this card's effects. Nightgaunt lets you search an entity or an insignia from your deck on summon, and you can recycle an entity from your graveyard upon it being sent from the field to the graveyard. Both effects exclude Nightgaunt himself and are at a hard 1 per turn, once per turn clause. Shantak's effect is reminiscent of the original effect, except it triggers on being used as material for any non-outer entity monster summon, but locks you out of non-entity extra deck plays. All in all, these 4 make for a much more concise, usable, and consistent deck than the clusterfuck that was the original support, and I'm much more invested in seeing this deck in action now. However, as most of you must have assumed by now, the cuts don't end there either, as the extra deck needed to make some trimmings as well. They weren't as bad as the Pringles, but at this point it was sheer numbers that necessitated the cuts here. The ones who got the boot were Ditha, Thogwa, Sathla, and Feral. While I'm happy to see Feral gone since he did absolutely nothing for the deck, the other 3 were a bit harder to justify. Bluntly put, they were simply the most disposable of the lot. Ditha was just a gimmicky companion to Vorva, Thogwa was a token generator placed unfortunately in the wrong spot, and Sathla was unfortunately power cret by Super Poly going to 3. With these gone, however, there was a bit of disparity in the sub-archetype's attributes, however. Thus, in order to balance them out, I had to change the attribute on a few of them. ORRYX, the Elder Entity boss monster, became a wind because I can't change Natissa's attribute without an errata, which I can't afford in the number of cards. Yig became a dark, which is frankly more fitting than the original water attribute. And Lukthu became a water because I couldn't come up with an outer entity that better fit water, so fuck me. In addition to that, there were 2 more changes that needed to be made to accommodate the cuts as well. First of all, obviously Vorva needs to be changed, since without Ditha, his old effect doesn't work at all. Now his effect is to destroy one of any card, and his floating effect special summons any other Elder entity instead. Lastly, Kaiga was changed to be a tuner as well, since we needed another synchro tuner in the archetype now that Thogwa is gone. Now we're almost at the end of the list, so let's go ahead and move on to the insignia cards. No, they are not getting cut as well, just relax on this one. However, while I thought that these were perfect, as it turns out they were just a tad too specific. Not incredibly so, but just enough to make them borderline unplayable. To compensate for this, I changed the requirements to needing any entity in the extra monster zone as opposed to their specific sub-archetype. And this makes switching between them significantly easier and allows for more varied extra deck plays. In addition to this, I also renamed Call of Cthulhu and Shadows of Ralia to Call of the Entity and the Entity of Ralia, respectively. The reason for this is simply to make these searchable so as to make them actually consistent as opposed to bricky win more cards. Finally, the last change I made in this archetype is that I ended up cutting Order of Dagon entirely in order to get this archetype under the 25 card maximum, because the Samsara-like effect and the extra special summon isn't worth all the effort of keeping it in anyway. Whew! That's all the changes I made. Now I gotta resubmit most of these in order to get them approved on the server. Oh, and speaking of which, I also recently got hired by said custom cards format server as a tournament host, meaning that I'm going to be helping to bring the tournaments back to the server. If you're interested in taking any of these decks out for a spin and possibly making them competitive, feel free to join me there and let's take Deck Doctors to the top together. I'll link to the server in the description below, so make sure you check it out. Remember that the only one that's been approved so far is BLS, but that's eventually where you'll find them all. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, don't get run over, and I'll see you guys later.